Let's examine two ways that we might colorize a photograph. Maybe you want to apply an old tint to an image, something like that, age it, or you just want to give it a one-color look. In this case, in the first example, we have all these colors, all these flowers, and we want to give this image just a single tint. So we go into the magic Hue and Saturation, click the half moon icon down here, and go up to Hue and Saturation, and you click the Colorize button. When you do, it will remove all the color from the image and replace it with the color in Hue right here. We then begin moving around until we find the color that we want. But I would suggest that although this will work, there's an easier way to find the initial color. Let's do this. Let's get rid of this as if we'd never started. I'm going to drag that down the trash can. Now, select a color as your foreground color over here that you want to tint this image with. Over here in my swatches, I do have some warm brown colors and maybe something like that. So I click on this color here, it will change my foreground color down here. Now, go into Hue and Saturation and watch what happens when I click Colorize. When you select Colorize, it will first start with the foreground color, if there is one other than black. And you'll notice on my color hue right here, it's exactly based on that color. We can now change the saturation if we want to, increase or decrease, and we can change the lightness. Hue and Saturation is one way that we can apply a tint overall to a color image, but the best way to do that is to select the color first as your foreground color. That's one way. Let's look at another way. Let's go to this photo. Here's an old photo. There's Mom and the gang. And I want this image to look older in terms of having like a sepia tint. We'll actually use this image later on when we talk about photo restoration, because believe me, it looks 100 times better than it does before we get started on it. I want to give it that kind of sepia tint. We already have the color here, so we don't need to change that. But here's another way to do this. Create a blank layer above background. Just click the new button right here. Oh, incidentally, you can have up to 8,000 layers in one Photoshop document. Call me if you ever do something that much. What we want to do is fill that layer with that color. You could use the paint bucket tool, but don't waste your time. Reach over on your keyboard if you're using Windows and press Alt, Backspace. Alt, Backspace in Windows. It's also the Option Delete key on a Mac. Those are the same keys, just different names. That is the default for filling an area, a selection, or a layer with the current foreground color. With that done, we now have a layer that's totally full of that warm color. We got our image down here. I'm not talking about changing the opacity. I'm talking about changing something that I love, blending modes. We're just going to use one here. We'll get into blending modes in much more detail later. What I want to do is use one called Color, as in colorize. Select color. What does it do? It blends elements of the top layer with elements in the underlying layer. It is a bit much. I don't really want quite that much. So we will now use the opacity after we've changed the blending mode to color, and we'll knock that down until we get it exactly where we want it to be. Two actually really excellent ways to colorize an image. One using Hue and Saturation, but don't forget the trick of picking your foreground color before you colorize. And number two, creating a blank layer, filling it with the color, changing the blending mode to color, and then opacity to taste. Either way, you wind up with a pretty cool looking image.